Alrighty, well, thank all of you for coming out today for one of the Initiative for Science and Society's SciComm Lunch&Learns. So for anybody in the room, if this is your first SciComm Lunch&Learn that you've been to, a little bit of background. So I am Ariana. I am a postdoc working with Science and Society underneath the Director of Science Communication, Dr. Joy Weintraub. And we started doing these monthly events where we bring in a really interesting speaker about some really cool facet of science communication in some way for them to do a kind of brief kind of discussion of what it is they do, and then a really interactive and conversational time for you all to kind of get engaged with what it is that they're doing. And so this is our 6th SciComm Lunch&Learn. We just started these last spring, or this past spring rather. And we have one more coming up for this semester. That'll be November 11th with Dr. William Parker. He's going to be talking about vaccines and autism. And so if you have signed up for the Science and Society newsletter, you can find out more information there. But for our Lunch&Learn today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Andrew Aghapour. So I know Andrew because he was one of my improv coaches when I was doing improv in Chapel Hill.
She was my best. Oh, that's awesome. I'll turn that down.
It's really loud. I don't know how to turn it down. But Andrew did his PhD in religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill. And he is interested in this kind of nexus of religion and science. And he's going to give a little bit more info and background about himself. But in addition to kind of his scholarly work, he's also a really brilliant storyteller, and he's told stories for the Monty. And I guess without much further ado, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you. Give it up for Ariana, everyone. At a more reasonable mic level, I'll try to. How's that? Oh, it's even louder even though I'm turning it down. Better? Worse? Okay, yeah, there we go. If the feedback kicks up and it's just like destroying your ears, just give me a little, just go like this. And I'll figure it out. Hi, I'm Andrew. So nice to be here. My thanks to Duke Science and Society and to Drs. Ely and Weintraub for having me. Thank you. Oh yeah, thank you. I'll go off mic for a second. Yeah, I'll go off mic. I'll try to speak loud, and we'll probably get this back up and running in a second. But okay, hey. I'm Andrew. I'm a comedian and I'm a scholar of religion. Once again, thank you to Ariana Ely, Dr. Ely, and Dr. Joy Weintraub for having me. This is an amazing initiative that you all have, so let's give a round of applause for everybody on staff who made it. So this is off now. Okay, I'm going to go without and be loud. Will it still capture fine for the live? Okay, cool. And if I'm getting quiet, just let me know. I'll be happy to recalibrate this. So yeah, my name's Andrew. I'm really excited to be here. And I want to just start by giving y'all a quick sense of who I am. I'm one of those people who got a PhD and then there were no jobs. So I have multiple jobs. I'm a scholar and a comedian. The two things that I do in life, pretty much 50-50, is I am a scholar. I have a PhD in religion and science from UNC Chapel Hill, where I studied the history of religion and science and the way that religion and science the way that religion happens in the brain. And I'm also a comedian. I do stand-up, improv, storytelling. I have a one-person show, and I do a lot of improv and stand-up teaching and consulting. Those are the two aspects of my work that I'm going to try to bring together in this talk. I know that y'all come from a lot of different backgrounds, whether you're working directly in the sciences or indirectly. You probably are somebody who has expert knowledge, and maybe that's why you're here, because I wrote a blurb about how I can give you some tips on how to translate your ideas for a general audience. That's what we're going to do today. I'm going to use some of my experiences going deep into nerding out on stuff, along with my experiences on how to do comedy and translate yourself for a very broad audience, talk a little bit about how they combine. So I'm going to talk about both of the things that I do. The boring one first. I'm a scholar of religion and science. And I chose this image because it was the highest resolution one on Google Images when you type in religion and science. So I did my PhD. I did a master's at Cambridge in the history and philosophy of science. I studied the scientific revolution and some theories about what it is about science that makes it so uniquely science-y. And then I decided I wanted to study religion more, and I decided to stop at the master's at Cambridge and come here to Chapel Hill, or to North Carolina, where I went to the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill and studied religion. I am a scholar of the history of religion and science and how they intersect in really weird ways. So most of you, statistically, if I asked y'all what you think about religion and science, at least 50% of you would say that they're in conflict, that they're always fighting against each other. That's like the general attitude about religion and science. I'm somebody who studies the weird stuff, the moments where they intersect and do other things that we wouldn't expect. If religion and science were inherently at odds, then how do we explain things like the Qibla finder on my phone that will point me to pray to Mecca? How do we explain Buddhist meditators that use augmented tech to study the brain waves of how samadhi meditation is different from Vipassana meditation? I'm really interested in those weird things that defy our expectations about religion and science. And so I spent a long time, about 10 years, doing a PhD studying those different things with a focus on the brain. While I was in graduate school, I also started doing some public scholarship. I started out by writing for Religion Dispatches, like little 1,000-word articles that would go online about contemporary news and events and how they related, how religion and science could tell us things about the modern day. I also now work for the Smithsonian, the National Museum of American History, where I'm helping to curate an exhibit on religion and science in American history. And that's really cool. We're going to open probably in a year and a half. I've been with the project for about 3 years. And once we're open, I encourage y'all to come up to DC, see this crazy exhibit that we're putting together. It's going to be super fun. One of the things I learned in the process is that it's really hard to tell stories in 150-word paragraphs that are in front of an object at a museum, right? One of the objects we're probably going to include that I love is this thing. Does anyone recognize what this is? This is the Jefferson Bible. Thomas Jefferson really liked the Bible, but didn't like miracles or the supernatural or anything that wasn't sciencey. So he cut that shit out. He just had this idea that he wanted to make a Bible that only included the version of God, the version of the universe that he believed in. And there's a really fun story that we could talk about later if y'all wanted, about how the Smithsonian found this. But it wasn't he didn't show this to anyone. He was super on the DL about it, understandably. But it was discovered at the Smithsonian, and it tells a really interesting story to me about an American impulse to make truth, right? We want to figure out the world. We want to bring the texts and expertise that we can access to help us make sense of who we are within the universe. He did it with, some, an X-Acto knife and a Bible. And we're going to have that at the museum if you'll want to come and look at it. So my work as a scholar, I feel like my intellectual trajectory is one that a lot of y'all will be familiar with. I spent a lot of time in my silo doing a deep dive into the scholarship of my choice, religion and science, getting really into the weeds about the things that I studied. And then when it came time to write about them for a more public audience, 1,000-word op-eds or 150-word museum object descriptions, it gets a lot harder. Right? You get so deep into what you study that you have to learn a whole new second skill of how to translate your work for a broader audience. This is also something that I experienced a lot as a teacher, where I would start, when I first was a teacher, I thought that everything that I thought was interesting would be interesting to students. And I'd be like, did you know that the idea of witnessing in experimentation when Robert Boyle did it during the scientific revolution was informed by Calvinism? And everyone's like, no, we don't care, right? So it took me a while to figure out what people care about and what it takes to convince people that something's interesting. One of the things that helped me do that was my training as a comedian. The most recent comedy project that I've done is a one-person show called Zara that we premiered in March of this year in downtown Durham. I'll tell you a little bit about this show. It's my autobiographical history of monotheism. I was raised by a British Christian mother and an Iranian Muslim father who escaped the revolution and came to the United States without documentation. It was pre-9/11, so it was cool, he made it. And I was raised with two religions at once, Muslim and Christian. And my parents were super chill about having two different monotheisms in the same household. So mom would be like, yeah, there's Allah, who you pray to. There's also God, the Christian God, and they're both the one God. I was like, how does that make sense? And she was like, oh, don't worry about it. It's all cool. Also, there's three Christian gods. It's called the Trinity. There's Jesus. There's a ghost. There's also Santa, who you should know about. It's too much for me. In the Zara show, I tell my own personal history of my relationship to the truth. Of first being raised with multiple absolute truths, then going through a period of nihilism induced by my introduction to bacon and marijuana when I was in college, and then a kind of third place where I'm at now. And in that show, I set my own history against the history of monotheism. I open with the first monotheistic prophet in recorded history. His name was Zarathustra. This was ancient Persia, not that far from where my dad grew up. And I just think it's cool that there was ever a first monotheist, a first person who's like, okay, everyone here believes in multiple gods? No, there's just one, and it's my God. I believe in the one God. It was like a super, I know everyone, I'm reading the audience, seeing if this is offensive. I promise you, I'm a good person. I just think it's a cool move because no one had done that before. It'd be like if we were in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where there's all those superheroes running around, and I was like, hey, listen, only Thor. Only Thor. You'd be like, oh, so Thor is your favorite? No, there is only Thor. There has only ever been Thor. And if you talk about Iron Man, you're in trouble. Right? It was a bold move, and Zarathustra did it. So I named my show and my daughter after Zarathustra, because I just thought it was so cool to just be that big energy about God. So that's that show. And in that show, I try to weave together religion and science. I also am an improviser and a stand-up comedian. For almost 10 years now, I've been teaching, practicing, performing weekly, various types of comedy. And has anyone here ever taken a comedy class? Maybe like at Meddlesome, downtown, or here at the university? Cool. If you have not taken a comedy class and you're interested in getting better at communication, I 100% highly recommend doing it. If you want to find a really cool local place to do it, there's a theater that I perform with sometimes called Meddlesome, Mettlesome. This is Meddlesome.com. They teach classes. The reason I think comedy is such an amazing thing to train yourself in is it teaches you some of the fundamental rules of how communication works. So has anyone here ever been to a live comedy show? Has anyone ever at a live comedy show completely lost your mind laughing? Yeah, and then it's always hard to translate to people why it was funny, right? Is that familiar? You're like, he was talking about bagels and you just had to be there, right? It's so good. The thing about improv, and sorry, do you all know what improv is? So in case you haven't done improv or seen improv, it's another form of comedy where, unlike stand-up where we pre-write our material, in improv we completely make it up. It'll be, Ari and I have done improv together. It'll be 2 people or maybe 4 or 5 people, and we'll get a suggestion from the audience and create comedic scenes just on that suggestion. The reason I think that comedy is so useful for all of us to study, and the reason that I found it so useful when I was learning how to teach and lecture, is that there are some fundamental patterns to human communication that comedians had to already figure out. And you can go to a theater and learn them and then use them however you want. And we'll talk about some of those skills in just a little bit. I feel like I should do improv, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot to come do it with me. So like in improv, I'll give you an example. So somebody give me a relationship like a attorney-client or...
Dad and son.
Dad and son, great, awesome, thank you. So if I'm walking out to do improv with somebody and the suggestion is dad and son, we have to make up a comedic scene on the spot using only that suggestion. It seems daunting, except that there are some fundamental rules. Like if we have to evacuate. So if for example, I could tell my scene partner, let's say I wanted to play the dad, I could say, come take a seat, son. And I might say, as your father, I want you to know that, okay, here we go. I want you to know that I'm your father, but I'm also your friend. And as your father, I want you to know you should stop doing drugs. But as your friend, I want you to know, will you buy me some drugs? Right? That's funny because it subverts the expectation. A father-son relationship, the son is low status and is more likely to do bad things. The father is high status and more likely to hold the law, right? Do what's right. And so when a father says, like, can you buy me drugs? I probably shouldn't have said that live on the internet. But that's funny because it subverts our expectations. So one of the things we learn in comedy is how do we figure out what the expectations are and add a little twist. In comedy, I really believe as a teacher, it's like a random grammar diagram, that there is an underlying grammar of comedy. Fundamental rules that make us laugh, and also fundamental rules that engage us in a narrative and make it so that we don't get lost. My career has been spent jumping between these 2 places, trying to do scholarship that when I start to speak to the public uses some of the tools of comedy to make them more interesting and more effective. And I promise I won't monologue for too much longer. We're going to do some of this together. We're going to discover some of the techniques and tools that we can use from comedy to make us better communicators about the specific research that we do. Before I go to the next, move on, any questions, any thoughts that anyone has bubbling up? Okay, cool. I'm giving that momentary pause because there are a subset of people who do have questions but who are shy and who need just enough pressure. Okay, cool. Well, there will be time. If you have inspiration, questions, if you get angry at me, whatever you want to do, you can interject at any time. I'm just riffing up here. So, scholars and comedians. Another reason, just to try to make the case in another way, another reason I think scholars can learn from comedians is that right now we're having a kind of crisis of intellectual authority between the climate change and some of the disinformation that's happening across our country in both political and social spectrums. We are going through a moment where we're trying to figure out how to communicate as experts to the general public and have them believe us when we've done all the work to get expert knowledge. One thing we could do is just keep writing in the way that we're used to writing. Keep saying things in the refined and specific languages of our individual discourses, because that's the best way to communicate kind of pure information to each other, to people who are trained in the thought styles, instruments, discourses that we're trained in. But that hasn't been going that well. I think that scholars, and that includes scientists, would benefit, it would help the world if we got better at explaining what we do, how we do it, and what we know to the world. That's my pitch moving forward. After I did this show, the Zara show, we did like 3 big shows in the spring, and I did like all these, I did some artists in residencies, which meant doing a lot of conversations in classrooms and spaces like this one. And one of the things that kept coming up when I was making this pitch, that I think all scholars ought to learn how to communicate to broader audiences, we would get into some discussions about the differences between scholarship and comedy. And a couple people had asked me point blank, like, but aren't they fundamentally different? And at first, I was like, well, I think they're the same thing. Whether you're a scholar or a comedian, you're trying to talk about the truth. But then I got a lot of really helpful pushback, that there are differences, right? Scholarship is about the world. Especially in science, we try to eliminate our subjectivity and arrive upon truths that might exist in nature to the extent that that's possible, which would mean we're taking ourselves out of it. Comedy, on the other hand, is about something else. And so I spent this summer after the show trying to figure out what comedy was. Like, what is the difference between comedy and like other forms of truth finding? And if you'll permit me, I'll tell you about something that happened. So I did this crazy big show and kind of got burnt out over the spring, so I decided I would take the summer off. So I put my projects on hold, and I spent a lot of time raising my now 2-year-old daughter. That's her cute little face, right? I did it, I made a cute baby, with help. So she's awesome, and I'm spending a lot of time with her this summer. And a cool thing about, well, one cool thing about babies is you can't be so consumed. Like, I was consumed with like, what is comedy? Why is it about us? How does it reveal the nature of the self? And then having a kid, you can't do that anymore because you have to clean up the vomit. So I was spending a lot of time with my daughter this summer. I also am having a lot of fun with developmental stages. Does anyone have a kid who's like under the age of 3? Yeah, it's super fun because you have all these milestones that happen really fast. It's like, she has object permanence. She can eat solid foods. She's angry for no reason. All these things that humans love to do, she learned how to do all of them. And at the top of the summer, the next milestone that I was kind of excited about was for Zara, my daughter, to develop a sense of self. Because kids, when they're under the age of 2, there's like a pure continuum between self and world. They don't understand that they're separate from it. But they're going to learn it, and you can help them do it. So I was teaching her, like, I would be in front of the mirror. I'd be like, Zara, look, that's you. And she would look in the mirror and say, Dada. Right? Looking at me, I'm like, no, okay. And I'd take a picture with my phone and say, look, that's Zara. And she would look and she would say, no, it's baby. And I'd be like, damn it. And she's like, damn it. I'm like, no. So I was trying to teach her this thing that she wasn't figuring out. And then one day, I made like a lunch date with one of my former advisors. I was pretty nervous because I was going to take my daughter with me to meet this guy who had never met her and is a very important person in my life. I wanted to impress. So I'm driving in the car with Zara in the back seat. Parents in the room know this setup where you have your rear view mirror, and then they're in a rear-facing car seat, but then you have another mirror that costs $12.95 that lets you see their face in the rear view. So I'm driving with her, and she had this water bottle. Ultimate water, like child-proof water bottle. Parents know it's the Camelback. It does not leak. They can like drink water without making a mess. So I'm driving 15.501, get into traffic. I'm trying to negotiate traffic, and I look in the rearview mirror, and and Zara's got the water bottle, and the top is completely off of it. She had somehow unscrewed the lid of this thing, and she's just holding 3 whole-ass cups of water like this. And I hear her go, and she looks at me, and I'm like, put it down. Put it down. Zara, put it down. And she starts shaking it and looking at my reaction. I getting a little water, and she's, I'm like, no, Zara, not funny. And she looks down, and she starts shaking it more, and she says, it's funny. It's funny. And I said, no, Zara, it's not funny. And she said, it's funny, Dada. It's Zara. And that was the moment. She has ever since known who she is. She knows that she's Zara. That was like a threshold moment before she got water all over herself, and I realized I didn't pack a change of clothes, where she identified who she was separate from the world in the act of being funny, right? In the act of pushing her will a little bit. And so that lingering question that had been on my mind all summer, it helped me understand it better. That when we're scholars, we often try to erase the world, or erase ourselves in the act of portraying the world. In comedy, the best comedy, and that was so funny, what she did. In comedy, we reveal our authentic, true selves in the minute that we break expectations or break the rules, right? You think I'm going to say this, I say this, that reveals myself. So my first big point, one of only 2 I'm going to make, is that all of us as scholars, whether you're a scientist, whether you're in the humanities, whether you go off and work in tech or wherever and gain expertise, one way that we can communicate to our audiences is by inserting humor. It gives a brief glimmer of the person that you are. And jokes don't have to be dirty, they don't have to be bad. They just have to be twists of expectations. And they are kind of punctuating moments of authenticity within the public presentations that we make. The second point, before we get into some exercises, is I want to talk about something I've learned as a storyteller, which is the difference between facts and stories. So we all know what it's like to discover a new fact, right? Maybe it is about the interaction between protein 5,3-BP1 and some other protein. Maybe it's the role of biofilm in the human appendix, or the electromagnetic properties of metamaterials. I don't know what any of these things mean, but Duke scientists discovered these things over the last year. So I looked them up thinking maybe one of you would have been the person who discover a fact, and you're really excited. And you go to tell somebody about it who's not a fellow expert. Maybe it's a parent or a partner or a friend, and you start to say it, but it doesn't make any sense unless you really know these other facts that are related to it. But those facts really mean that you have to understand these other facts, and if you're going to understand that, you have to understand this. And there's this entire constellation of things that you need to know in order to make sense of the thing I just discovered. Right? And we get bogged down. Has anyone ever had this experience? You start to explain something and you get lost. It reminds me of this deer that I saw zigzagging around my home. This is when I lived in Carborough. So I lived in Carborough. This is the intersection of North Greensboro and Suing Court for any Carborough people. So North Greensboro Road takes a 90-degree turn, so you can be south of North Greensboro Road, which I thought was so funny. And we were living in this house, and there was this British, it was me and my wife and my cat, and this British couple owned that. They were our landlords, and they were really nice, and they reminded me of my parents. And the cat was gray, and I wanted the apartment because there's this deer, there's a garden that was next to it, and it was near a bus line, the J line. So who got lost during that? That was a horrible story I just told, right? Like straight up, don't just be honest. Who got completely lost and hated it? It's because what I said made absolutely no sense, right? Here's why what I just said was terrible. I opened with, it reminds me of a deer that I saw in Carborough. And your mind was ready for a deer story, right? Do y'all remember when you were so naive? You thought there's a deer story coming? And then I did another sentence where I gave you just a bad joke about the street. But you still had in your RAM memory, in your working memory, that this was going to be a deer story. And then I told you even more context, that it was my apartment. And I still had you. And then I talked about my cat. And then the British couple that were our landlords. And then I went back to the cat. And I think most of you, when I was looking at eye contact, this was it. I'm checking out. You looked at your phones, which is what you should have done. Because what I did in terms of this representation is, I said I was going to talk about this, and then I just zigzagged all over. I just went all over the place. And the human mind can't keep that much information going without getting lost. Because the entire time we're thinking, okay, is this a deer story? Do I need to know about your British landlord for what you're about to tell me? And it gets overwhelming and our brains check out. So many conferences I go to in religious studies imagine it's the same in the sciences. I know it's the same across the humanities. We do this. We start with our facts that we want to talk about, and we get lost in all of the zigzags that are relevant without creating a more coherent narrative that walks an audience member through, and so that they can arrive at this place with a better understanding. Does that make sense? Are y'all with me? I'm sorry I tricked you. I had this idea last week. I was like, I should just bomb. So I never get to bomb on purpose. Whenever I bomb, it's always a mistake. It's fun to do it on purpose. I want to give you an example of what I think was a better story, and that was the one I told about my delightful daughter. So we can diagram this. I started with this moment when I wrote this last week. That thing happened in the car in real life. It's funny, it's solid. And when it happened, I was like, whoa, this was so amazing to me, so interesting. So I wrote out what happened, and then I started brainstorming. The next thing I wrote was, what's the context? And that's this stuff. The interpretation of why it's funny, right? That this was her first moment of consciousness, she's breaking the rules, I had the existing question about the nature of comedy. And then the next layer that I wrote was, I gotta tell you the backup, how we got here. And then I threw in, to have a joke, this thing in green, that little joke about object permanence, eating solid foods, getting extremely angry for no reason. In Stand-Up 101, we call that the rule of threes. You bring two normal things and then a third thing that twists that expectation. So the reason that story was way better than the deer story was that I staged this moment with some supporting structure, using some of the fundamental rules of comedy. Does that make sense? Cool. So here's what we're gonna do next. I could monologue forever about all the things that I teach in comedy classes, I could do the whole thing about how great that story was. But that's, didactic is boring, and I've already been talking for 30 minutes. We're gonna discover it. The best way to discover the fundamental rules of comedy and the ways that they're useful for us to actually speak in the public is for us to do it ourselves. So to do that, we're going to get some volunteers. I'm going to let everybody's confidence energy build for a second, and just say one other point about this, which is that in the writing of this story, this is what I call an aha moment. All of us, at least once a week, have an aha moment, a thing in your life where the stuff that you learned and the stuff that you know, and your like operating questions and concerns all crystallize, and you have like an epiphany. It doesn't have to be the topic of an entire article. It can be just a little tiny moment where you're like, oh, I get why this is this. Has anyone ever had it? Is that familiar to y'all? Let's do a poll. Who's had an aha moment in the last month? Cool. Awesome. Yeah. This Duke, y'all are so smart. The secret of comedy is that we give people the structure so that they experience the aha moment with us, right? I wanted y'all to feel the epiphany that I had when she said, it's funny you saw one. So I had to give you exactly enough so that y'all felt it. Does that make sense? Cool. So what I want us to do is think about aha moments of your own. So everybody for like 10 seconds, 30 seconds, I want you to think about the last time that, whether it was related to work or something in your own just like regular life, you had an aha moment where a bunch of stuff came together. Or I'm going to be quiet for 10 seconds. Cool. Who's got? Just raise your hand. I won't bring you up because of this. Who's got one locked in? Just a poll. Who has one? Okay, cool. People are like, I got one, but I'm not coming up. Cool. Let's just talk about them first. People who raise their hands. What's just a moment that you had where things came together? Yeah.
Me? Oh, so I'm writing an essay on how our importance we put on data and quantitative measurements in artificial intelligence and data will impact us socially.
And could you speak up just a little bit?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm writing an essay on how data application and the importance we put on data and quantitative measurements impacts us socially. And I had that aha moment where I put together the link between data and computation always being quantitative.
I'm going to keep these short. Even I'm sorry myself because I have 1,000 questions for you, but I'm not going to let myself do it. Thank you. Let's do this side of the audience. Who has an aha moment that they had that they want to share? And that was perfect. Just like what it was, you don't have to explain it in depth. Yeah, Ariana.
Yeah, so I have a turtle at home, and his tank keeps practically getting like neon green, and like I kept being like, when you do the tank, when you do stuff to put in it, and then the other day I went and I got some like algaecide, and I like dosed it with algaecide once, and now it's like perfectly clean, and so.
Good, so you figured out
Yep.
what. I love it. It's awesome. Thank you. Somebody over here. I'm not letting this group off the hook. Who has an aha moment over here?
I was just thinking in the context of,
And could you talk to me while I'm all the way over here?
I was just thinking in the context of your story. I was talking with a friend of mine who came here to have a speech, and then we were talking about sort of also religion and our origin, and we were talking, do you know those writings in the caves where the people look like, you know, they were people but sort of like aliens with some more sophisticated hats and so on. So it's possible that the origin of the people came from some other planet with some racket that crushed here. Everybody died, maybe just some children survived, and hence those drawings of the caves, and maybe they had to teach themselves everything from the beginning, the life in the earth and so on. So, and then it made me think, but what about the God, you know? And then it made me think about one priest that said, even if there is life in some other planet, still God is God, you know, it's obvious or something.
Oh, I love it. We should write a two-person show about it. God as alien as ultra God. I love that. It's so fun. What about over here? Thank you for that. Any other aha moments? And these are all great, right? It can be data. It can be turtle. Yeah.
I
I decided to try to explain corruption to my 7-year-old.
Oh, how did that
I was surprised at how easy it was actually, because a lot of times it's hard to explain things to kids because they have no context. And it was really easy to explain it. And so then it made me realize that it's kind of a really basic concept, and that's one reason why it's everywhere.
Yeah. What did you say? Because I got 5 years now to figure that out.
We live in Cary, so I said, you know, so say you're the leader and there's a developer that wants to cut down all the trees and put their business there. You also own a business that owns trucks, and you sell your trucks for $100 a truck. So the developer comes to you, wants to cut that down, you say no. And then the developer comes back and says, okay, I'll buy your trucks, but I'm gonna pay you $200 per truck. I'll buy 5 trucks. Can I have that land? And you say yes. And he understood that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you worked backwards from here. That's awesome. Thank you. Let's get one more. I'm loving these aha moments. These are all great. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Someone told me something that was like unintuitive, and I didn't really trust about orbital mechanics. And
About what?
Orbital mechanics.
Okay, I'm gonna
And so
pretend like I
went
know what
back
that
and,
is.
like, proved it using like high school equations of motion. It was just a really good moment.
Cool. Nice. Awesome. And you had your hand up too.
Yeah, the way that we value things like human life and kind of like natural resources and other ecosystem services, we don't do a very good job of it, especially when we only focus on monetary value of things.
Yeah.
So we have to find a new way of allotting value to things that don't necessarily have a monetary value.
Yeah, I love that. And in case y'all couldn't hear the last one, that we need more than monetary value to give value to things in our society and in our ecosystem. So in each of these cases, we have these really cool central insights. And I loved all of it, whether it's the possibility that God's an alien, or something about orbital mechanics that my brain already lost, or the reason that our aquarium was getting greener faster. We have these insights every day. The question is, what do we do, like if we're sitting with a kid trying to explain corruption, what do we do to reverse engineer the story so that they experience that insight empathetically, so that they can be walked through to have that experience themselves? That's what stand-up comedians do. We need you to see the world in a new way that's the way we see the world, so we have to work backwards and get you there. I think it's a tool that we can use no matter what our research expertise to communicate things to a broader audience. And data scientist who offered the first example, what's your name?
Alex.
Alex, would you be willing to come and do just a very short experiment with me? Since you went first.
I just want to point out that you first said the people who raised their hands.
Well, how about this, Alex? I would love for you to come up, but we need him to feel comfortable. So how about we give him a round of applause? And would you mind standing right?
I'm German, so I can't do comment.
Germans are the funniest. What are you talking about? So if you wouldn't mind, you can just stand there and kind of, I'll sit here. And here's what's going to happen. I'm just going to ask Alex some questions open-endedly. We're not trying to be funny. We don't have this is not an outcome-oriented exercise. We're just doing some exploring and seeing what comes up. So could you restate, kind of for everybody, the insight that you shared at the top?
Okay, so I have a background in data science and worked there, and I'm now looking more at the policy side and the philosophical side of things. And I was really focused on the very specifics of different statistical methodologies. And I kind of got lost in the very basic insight that every computation is in essence quantitative.
Okay, say that last thing.
Computation is quantitative, always, or based on numerical measures.
Okay, I love that. So I don't have any idea what that means because I'm a stupid humanities person. And here's how we're going to figure out what it means because I want to learn. So could you talk to me a little bit about, you said you worked in these two spaces. One was data science and another was what?
Now I'm looking more at the philosophical side of
Philosophical. Could you tell me just about what each of those, just like explain a little bit more each of those terms?
Okay, so I was working with a Swiss retail company, and we were figuring out how we could use the data we have on customers and their purchases to use statistical models to predict their interest in different products.
Interesting. So
That would be an example.
of both of those things combining? Or just data science?
Just the data science.
And what about philosophy?
Now I'm more interested in what the growing usage of this technology makes with us as a society.
Okay, cool. Great, love it. Let's move a little bit farther towards your insight. So, and restate it one more time for me. Blank is blank, you said.
Computation is quantitative.
Computation is quantitative. So why did that not make sense to you at first?
It is very, very obvious, but I was very much lost in the specifics of the models so that I didn't see the basic underlying assumption.
Uh-huh. And can you give me an example of a real life scenario? You've already given one about shopping, of how this insight affects like me on a day-to-day basis.
So you are more or less confronted with those algorithms in your daily life. For example, if you would use Tinder and not be married, and you would
See, he did it, Joe.
and it might be, I'm very familiar with that some algorithm is predicting which person you might find attractive and might swipe and put that person up first.
Yeah.
So that that prediction is solely based on quantitative facts, meaning how old that person is, some quantitative analysis on the picture she has, and stuff like that.
So this is fascinating that when you say computation is quantitative, I love the Tinder example. If you've been on Tinder, I've seen someone use it and I was very disoriented by it. It seems so qualitative, right? Romance is about the subject that the full person that you are trying to get to know, to have a relationship with. And that was in contrast to what you just said about these quantitative data points.
That is awesome, and that is exactly what I'm trying to work out, or like, I'm interested in that concept that our relationships are often more qualitative, and we assign a different kind of quality to it.
Yeah.
But in those scenarios, they are reduced to specific facts, data, numbers, in essence.
I love that. Can you just, this is awesome. Could you just restate, starting with Tinder and ending on your point about how computation is quantitative?
I can try to do that. If you're thinking about meeting your next personal partner and would potentially use an app for that, like Tinder, these suggestions that come up are not based on what we would previously experience in a personal relationship with that person, but solely on data and facts were then translated into numbers to make a prediction.
Awesome. And just to bring it home, why is that so imperative for you as something that you need to know in the work that you do?
That is important to me because I think that this reducing relationships or just everything into quantitative measures has an impact on how we view the world and how our society operates and the values we place on things.
Yeah. Let's give a huge round of applause. That was awesome, right? That was inherently interesting, super compelling. We opened with you independently thought of Tinder as an example, which is like, very a common thing that even if you haven't used it, you know what it is. We started with something that was universal, we got down to a particular, and then we came back out to why it's useful for everyone to know. Did anyone else like me not understand what computation is quantitative meant until we got through the process? Cool. Like, I'm a dummy. I did not, when he first said computation was quantitative, I was like, shit, I have to I have to figure out what this means to not look stupid in front of all these scientists. That was my initial thought, right? But then, I'm a meditator, right? I know how to label thoughts. Like, that's a fear-based thought. How do we engage and figure out openly what's going on? And Alex did a fantastic job providing us with big picture, here's the point, here's why it's relevant. Can anyone think of an example, maybe of in the past, how you've done this, whether it's with a kid you're explaining corruption to, or in your field of work, how some of this kind of general structure can be useful, big picture specific? Yeah.
So I wanted to explain nanotechnology to a bunch of younger kids, but I knew that just blurting out the facts wasn't going to be enough. So I drew a little comic where the character was created first, and then on top of that I added the layers of scientific fact, and it seemed to work pretty well with them.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Any other? I would love more examples. Yeah.
So this is a couple of years ago. I gave a TEDx talk about why people don't really care about climate change and kind of how
Could you
they're-
talk to us?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago I gave a TEDx talk about why people don't really care about climate change, and to kind of get people on board. In the beginning, I talked about stories about what got me into science from an early age and what made me curious about science, and then kind of why I became really interested in climate change, and why then it was confusing for me why other people weren't interested in climate change. So I kind of brought people along with the story.
It's fantastic, and what a great example of how personal narrative can help us walk people through why something's interesting. Tinder as like a large social phenomenon, or our autobiography, these are ways to provide narratives to help people have this version of something instead of the crazy zigzag version of something. I saw some other hands of times that you use narratives. Yeah.
I just like the general one that's pretty simple on like statistical inference. It's like if you're making a soup and you want to get a sample of like if that soup is good or not, you're not going to try the whole soup. You're going to take like a little spoonful of the soup, and if it's representative of the whole soup, then yeah, you say you can infer that the whole soup is good.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. That's so great. Yeah, a great example of how useful metaphor can be. I saw another hand was, yeah.
So one of the narratives that I have also seen is teaching science, like engineering, to very small kids is actually easier than teaching marketing to engineers. Because in my course, I've taken a marketing, and none of that makes sense initially because engineering is very absolute. Because you know the logic, you know the underlying science, you know the math, and it has to work out. If it's not working out, you did it wrong. But marketing is exactly opposite, because you have to estimate the results. Then you have to create your sales and marketing first, and then you have to decide whether you want to launch the product or not. So in those scenarios, whenever we try to do it by this way, every time we get it wrong, and then we have to think like humans, and take very weird assumptions which sort of does not make sense to an engineer.
Yeah.
Like if I say you that place a complex, like place some sort of any cereal on the top shelf, an engineer would say it does not matter, I will utilize my space. But then marketing says no, but the kids won't see it. So you sort of decide to put it like in the lower shelf in the shopping complex, and suddenly everything makes sense. Because now you see your sales going up, parents are being promoted to buy more sort of cereals, your advertisement working really well.
Yeah.
So it sort of is very weird, because when you told about how being engineers or scientists are like not identifying but being sort of a part of the science or the work, but again when you become sort of a comedian, or basically you put your fact ahead, you identify yourself. So to understand this drift and understand the narrative of being human, in doing something really helps a lot in understanding bigger things in context.
What's your name?
My name is Tushnik Goswami.
Tushnik, I loved what you said. I think I should retitle this "Thinking Like a Human." Right? That's such a funny and wonderful articulation of this idea that all of us, in order to do the hyper-skilled intellectual work that each of you does, you actually have to stop. You have to train yourself to think not like a human sometimes, to think in these really specific, very kind of rarefied and unique ways. And then it's that work of, right, how do I teach a human this? We're running out of time. I want to leave a little bit of time for open questions. But let me just kind of recap where we are, in case that's helpful for your brain, or all of our brains. That my work as a scholar / comedian has taught me two things. One is that humor is a really effective way to communicate to a broad audience, because if they're intimidated, if they're confused, it instantly kind of punctuates that atmosphere and gives them a brief look at you, kind of an authentic version of yourself that helps buy people into the narrative. The second thing, that difference between facts and stories, the difference between the deer story and the Zara funny story, is that difference between the work that we do and then the work that we have to do to think like a human, to present it like a human, where we still want to get our insights, but then we want to think about what we then need to do in order to reverse engineer the aha moment for our audience. How can we communicate in a way that an audience member, no matter what their background, can themselves have that same epiphany, understand that computing is quantitative, just in the act of listening to what you have to say. There's lots of sub-skills that, unfortunately, there's just not time to talk about, but if you want to take a comedy class, you'll learn a lot of that stuff. And I'm sure there's also tons of resources that better experts than me can help you with, including Ariana. Are there any questions before we run out of time?
Yeah, I think you make a great talk, but I like what you're saying about we have to make stories, then comedy is a great form of discourse for this. I see two potential pitfalls, and I'm curious to get your advice on it. Two ends. One is, how do you avoid making something too light of something, so levity, so they don't take your point seriously, right? It's like, oh, I made fun of something, I don't have to take it. And then on the other side, what about if they're like part of their self-identity, right? And then you're touching on comedy of something that they hold sacred, and then you're going to have a backfire effect. You're going to believe it less. So they've got two potential pitfalls for comedy.
Yeah, I love that. To restate the questions, again, if you'll need to bounce, totally understand. The first question, how do you avoid kind of lowering the expectations of you because you're being funny, and then how to avoid offending people? This is something we teach in stand-up 101 all the time. To answer the second question, you never want to make comedy about something that you are not a part of, right? So, like, I feel comfortable making jokes about God as a scholar of religion with an entire show about my belief in God or non-belief or whatever. So I feel like we shouldn't make jokes as outsiders, but only as insiders. That's a safe way to avoid that second problem. And with the first, the idea of like, how do we do jokes without kind of lowering the tone, you definitely always have to read your audience. And I think that just one or two jokes is enough to punctuate a presentation and keep people paying attention. Of course, you don't want to do like a 15-minute set at the top of an important presentation, because then it's like, what is this person doing? What need is not being met that they need to do this right now? So you definitely, those are such good pitfalls to be aware of. And I would just say, it's often about the nuances of the performance that can come with practice too. Do we have time for one more question? Let's do one more.
So thank you. So I like this stories model thing that you have. It's both aesthetically pleasing and seems somewhat effective. The orange dot, you were interested in computation and quantitative because you're interested, right? It seems to presuppose the fact that your audience is interested, and I feel like a lot of the issues that we face in like public discourse are due to the fact that people just aren't interested in a certain topic that's relatively pertinent to them or the wider society. So how do you use this model for people who just like don't care?
It's a great question. Yeah, how do we do people who don't care? There is always going to be, you might have to zoom out pretty wide, right? Sometimes, like the Tinder example is so great that I bet Alex has zero actual research interest in Tinder, but it's probably, or maybe he does.
Define research.
But if we can find the thing that's one step away from what we do, that is a lightning rod, that is, or not a lightning rod, that is a massively interesting thing, we want to find whatever it is that's going to capture 90% of the audience's attention, and then we can walk them towards the thing that we're trying to convey. It takes brainstorming. I always start here and then end up brainstorming like 3 different things that will be the attention grabbers, and you kind of have to figure out which one is best. It does take, I think that we sometimes don't want to do that because it feels dishonest. Like, well, I don't actually work on Tinder, joke aside. But if we can think widely and figure out that access point, that's just the top 1 minute of a talk that's grabbing that 50% of people who might have zero interest, and then hopefully we're going to keep walking them through so they keep up. That would be the goal. And if you have specific things that you want to brainstorm, we can talk after. I'll hang out if anyone wants to keep talking. I don't want to go over. I know that you'll have places to be. Thank you so much for your time.